Anin dina maganak, anin aneshnapekweg, mizaweka megokpepa moting dezenakaz, Fishing Lake First Nation Dunji. Hello all my relations, and hello to all strong Indigenous women. My name is Dr. Jackie Ottman, and I'm Vice Provost of Indigenous Engagement at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm here to introduce someone that I've looked up to for the last 22 years. That's when I began my graduate studies at the University of Saskatchewan. In the review of literature for my assignments, I found Verna's powerful work. I was immediately drawn to it, and to add to my enthusiasm, Dr. St. Denis's office was down the hall from where I studied. Today, I still weave anti-racism and anti-oppressive theories, principles, and practices into my work. I believe that we cannot move forward with meaningful reconciliation until we address systemic racism and all forms of oppression. Dr. Verna St. Denis is a member of Beardy's and Okamasas First Nation and grew up as a non-status Indian and Métis in Parkland, Saskatchewan. She earned her PhD from Stanford University and is now a professor in educational foundations at the University of Saskatchewan, where she has been a faculty member since 1992. In addition to teaching anti-oppressive education at both the undergraduate and graduate levels, she supervises graduate students' research in anti-racist education and provides professional in-service for schools and other educational organizations. As of January of this year, 2021, Verna became the first ever special advisor to the President on anti-racism and anti-oppression, and is leading the development and implementation of the university's anti-racism, anti-oppression policy and strategic work. I am grateful to know Verna personally, and I know that you will gain important learnings from her session today. Take care, stay safe, miigwech.
Good morning. Thank you, Jackie, for that introduction. And I regard myself as an anti-racist scholar in the College of Education. And so what I'd like to share today builds on a short little paper called Myths That Blind the Role of Beliefs in School Change. And so it's been over 50 years since Indian control of Indian education, and we have been working hard to make public education a safe place for Indigenous students, and yet we continue to have some challenges. And I think that this little article is a good jumping off point to highlight some of the research and thinking that I've been engaged with, but also barriers to change. So in this article, Yuluchi makes an argument that it's really meaningful change is hampered by perceptions and beliefs, particularly the perceptions and beliefs of teachers and school administrators. And so she makes an argument that we have to critically examine the beliefs about the students that we teach. And so she provides a framework for thinking about what are the kinds of interventions and strategies that we've used to promote change. And she identifies the political aspect of school change, that is the push and pull over resources, the technical, which we've been engaged for at least since the 70s, and that's revision to curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, and school organization. And then lastly, she identifies normative beliefs. And this is where I want to focus my attention. And that's where she focuses her attention on how difficult it is to reform core normative beliefs about race, class, intelligence, and educability. And so what she suggests is that it is the role, it's the expectations and perceptions that impact interactions, and that these have consequences. So in other words, beliefs matter. And she argues that negative beliefs about worthiness, aptitude, merit, and effort, they come together to authorize underachievement. And so one of the ways in which this occurs is through strategies of blaming the victim. So what is blaming the victim? That notion of blaming the victim was articulated by William Ryan in his book that he published in 1971, in which he argues that programs of compensatory education focus their efforts on building up the skills and attitudes of, he's writing about an American context. He says, compensatory programs and educational programs aim to build up the skills and attitudes of the ghetto or indigenous child, in my case, rather than implementing structural change in schools. And this blaming the victim happens through one of many ways, but the three that I have focused on, and I'll only be able to cover what deficit discourses are. But basically, there are three of many ways: deficit discourse, colorblind discourse, or race-blind discourse, or the denial that racism exists and matters in our education, and then also the belief in meritocracy, the belief that that we all, the place that we occupy in the social structure of our society can be explained by our intelligence and hard work alone, and doesn't take into consideration racism, white supremacy in our society. So what is deficit discourse? Basically, it locates the reason for school failure in students and their cultures and their families. And so deficit discourse is a long, long story that is part and parcel of colonization. And basically what it does is it situates school failure in the minds, the bodies, the communities, and the cultures of the students. And so in that way contributes to blaming the victim. Basically what it makes assumptions that children fail because of deficiencies that are internal to them, because of genetic disposition, because of cognitive or motivational family dysfunction. And so that's that deficit discourse that was, which worked to justify colonization, which works to justify expropriation of land resources. And so it's been very effective, an effective tool of colonization. So what does it sound like? What do we hear in schools? And this is just a sample, a small sample. And when I present to teachers and I ask them to identify the kinds of narratives that they hear about Indigenous children and their parents, it might sound like this. And this is just a few. Those parents don't care about their children's education. Those kids don't have any role models at home. They were simply refused to take advantage of the opportunity presented to them. And this is, look at the gene pool, or it can't be helped, look where they're coming from. Those families and children are disorganized, non-competitive, anti-intellectual. Those parents are not interested in the educational achievement of their children. Why bother sending books home? They'll never be returned. And so in this way, deficit discourse and deficit explanations for low academic achievement, it basically what it does is reserve education as white property. And so, so deficit thinking, it blames children, their families, and their communities for low academic achievement, and deflects In that way, schools are able to deflect their role in children's low performance. Educators often assume that schools work and students, parents, and communities need to change to conform to an already effective, caring, and equitable system. And so it shifts the focus from who the problem is, what the problem is, from schools needing to change to continually focusing on the children and their families. And this is a strategy that has such a long history. And one of the documents in where it's filled with deficit discourses in the Hawthorne report that was completed in 1967, in which you see an accumulation of this, what I refer to as decades and centuries of deficit discourse, in which Indigenous parents are maligned and denigrated as not caring. In the Hawthorne report, there are 2 volumes. In the second volume, there are 2 chapters on education in which the researchers did a study of how Indigenous students were doing at the very early stages of integrated public education. So this would be late 50s into the 60s. The study was completed in 67, so a little over 50 years ago. And basically that report characterizes, for example, the Indian community and the child's parents in particular often do not see school achievement as essential to future success. And so we've been characterized as not having strongly held convictions about the value of completing high school. And this deficit discourse, what it does is contribute to individualizing, psychologizing, and moralizing the consequences of racism in education, such that systemic barriers, enforced poverty, and racism are erased by referring to Indigenous students as lacking in interest and commitment, lacking in a belief in their ability, and lacking motivation. So these are long-standing, well-entrenched narratives. Basically what a deficit discourse is that it takes the focus away from the teacher's responsibility. Because teachers mobilize deficit thinking through decisions they make regarding how to respond to a student who's expected to perform well versus a student who's regarded as having behavioral or academic learning deficits. And so what that contributes to then is low teacher expectation of students. And so it enacts that self-fulfilling prophecy whereby we know that what adults believe about a young person's capacity often determine what they will achieve, what will be achieved. And so teachers' expectations have that self-fulfilling prophecy effect on student achievement. And this is research and studies that have been conducted since the 60s that illustrate and demonstrate that teacher expectations is a powerful factor in educational achievement. And this is common in countries, colonized countries. So for example, this study documented that teacher expectation on Maori students in New Zealand. And in that study, all teachers placed responsibility for academic achievement with students, parents, and home background. So in their study, they found that 8 of 10 teachers made negative comments about Maori Indigenous students. They cited home background as detrimental to student achievement, that parents were not involved and unsupportive, and therefore lacking in education, and that Indigenous students were lacking role models as an explanation for the failure of schools to meet the needs of Indigenous students. And so and then they cite this teacher who states, I haven't I've learned that there are only a certain amount of things you can do. There are some things that are beyond my control. I don't try and make tall claims. I want to get everyone merit. I don't do that. And sometimes trying to put them under pressure is not very good. So what we see and what we hear here is this benevolence of having low expectations as a way to supporting students. And of course that low expectation is something that is also experienced here in Canada and also documented in the Hawthorne report, in which for example, in the 1960s, the Hawthorne report acknowledged that teacher beliefs about Indians and Indian life are predicated upon stereotyped information, misinterpretation of Indian behavior, and unquestionable use of standardized group intelligence tests. In general, school authorities are convinced that Indian parents do not care about their children. And so this is the era in which we're moving into integrated schools, into a small, in my case, rural schools where teachers and parents of pioneer settler communities were ill-prepared to have us in their classrooms sitting next to their children. And so what they did acknowledge actually in that report was that teachers did not expect Indian students to perform well in school at any level, and that really there was little enthusiasm about teaching these children because they were accepted, imagine, as ineducable, so why try? And so this is a narrative and a practice that continues today. In my research in Saskatchewan in 1998, we hear teachers, Indigenous teachers that we interviewed as part of looking at the experiences of Indigenous teachers in public schools. This teacher explained so many of those kids we've had recommendations from the grade 8 teachers saying, oh well, I bet your year's income that you won't keep that student there. So imagine that people are actually, betting. Like if you want to win the bet, you want to make sure that Indigenous kids fail, which is an explanation that we seldom take a look at. And then in 2010, the study that I did for the Canadian Teachers Federation, that was involved interviewing Indigenous teachers across the country. And again, we hear this concern from Indigenous teachers about low expectation and they expecting less of Aboriginal students, being guided and encouraged at a mainstream, and often characterizing students as lazy, unmotivated, and indifferent. So that remains a challenge. It's a challenge to disrupt beliefs and perceptions, and those beliefs and perceptions are rooted in colonial, racist characterizations of who Indigenous people are. And so here is my final slide is how does this deficit discourse of deficit thinking impact Indigenous education? So if we go at the top, oppressive discourse of the, quote, deficient other, characterizing Indigenous children and Indigenous parents as not caring about education, that then justifies oppressive educational practice of lowering expectation, that then makes it almost impossible to carry on. And then the outcome of that is low academic achievement. The achievement gap is a consequence of the discourse and the practice of low expectation that results in that outcome and then normalizes. And so it maintains itself, the deficit thinking, maintains and ensures ongoing inequality. And I know that Indigenous scholars have been bringing attention to the problem of deficit thinking for many, many decades.